Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey Adapters, welcome back to another exciting episode. Joining me is Katie MacDonald, the co-founder of Tailwind, a pioneering firm dedicated to driving innovation in climate adaptation. Katie and I discussed Tailwind's latest project, the Adaptation and Resilience Innovation Playbook. And yes, that's exactly what it is, a playbook. We discussed the critical role of governments for driving global demand for adaptation solutions to the untapped potential of corporations as the sleeping giants of resilience investment. We also explore how startups will play a key part in adaptation planning in the years ahead. Katie also shares actionable recommendations for policymakers, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens on how to seize opportunities in this emerging adaptation market. Whether you're an investor looking to enter the adaptation space or someone simply wanting to understand how resilience will shape our collective future, this episode is for you. There are some exciting things happening in the adaptation space, and this playbook gives you a vision of this future. Katie is a fantastic guest, and you'll learn a ton. But before we dive into this episode, I want to share some exciting news. I'm heading back to ICR 25, hosted by Battelle. This will be my third time attending, and I hope to see many of you there. Battelle's fourth ICR-themed conference will take place April 21st through 23rd, 2025 in Washington, D.C., with the theme Partner, Accelerate, Launch. ICR 25 will bring together the brightest minds from industry, government, and academia to tackle the urgent need for scalable solutions. The conference will focus on critical areas like adaptation to help communities and ecosystems prepare for environmental change, mitigation, and sustainability to create long-term solutions for a healthier planet. It's an incredible opportunity to collaborate, innovate, and shape a sustainable future for generations to come. Early bird registration is now open, so don't wait. Sign up today and be part of the change. And if you actually want to present at ICR 25, they are still accepting abstracts. Visit battelle.org/conferences/ICR. That's battelle.org/conferences/ICR. And don't forget, they're still accepting abstracts. Support for America Adapt comes from Battelle, where science and technology are applied to help create a safer, healthier, more resilient world. Okay, let's go open that adaptation playbook with Katie MacDonald. Hey Adapters, welcome back to a very exciting episode. Joining me is Katie MacDonald. Katie is co-founder of Tailwind, an adaptation advisory and investment firm. Hi Katie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Doug. Great to be back.
Great to be chatting with you again, Katie. First off, you've been on before, but not everybody might have heard that episode. Give us what Tailwind's all about.
Sure. Yeah. So Tailwind, we are an advisory and investment firm focused 100% on supporting climate adaptation and resilience companies to start and scale to market. It's myself and my co-founder, Emily Mazzacurati. And when I say adaptation solutions, we're focused on any service or product that predicts, prevents, mitigates, or enables recovery from climate hazards like fires and heat.
You and I have known each other for a little bit here, and I just think it's a great evolution of the adaptation space that Tailwind even exists. It just shows we're growing fields. And so you're here to talk about a new playbook on adaptation. I want you just to describe that kind of really broadly, because we are going to dig into the details of the playbook, but just what inspired the creation of it?
Our team came up with the playbook concept because both in our own work and in our conversations with partners, everyone was asking us, hey, is this really going to be a $2 trillion market opportunity by 2030? How many startups are even working in this space of adaptation? And what kind of investor capital are you seeing being injected into the space? And so the playbook is our answer to all those questions in a very data-driven, thorough way, where we teamed up with some visionary founders, including Breakthrough Energy Fellows and Autodesk Foundation and Battelle, who I know you've worked with, and our partners, including Vibrant Data Labs, and put all the data and information we could find on those points into one report. So the playbook is really our big answer to our community of all those questions.
You've mentioned different groups and such, but really, who is the audience for this playbook?
The audience for the playbook is mainly as follows: entrepreneurs, so folks that are either currently leading adaptation companies that want to know how to scale and attract capital, investors that are either existing investors in resilience and adaptation or interested in resilience and adaptation investing, customers, including corporations that might be developing adaptation products or interested in acquiring them, and policymakers, folks that are creating the regulation and the programs necessary to get this stuff funded and available to communities.
We're going to be saying this a lot, but what does A&R mean? It might be obvious for some folks, but what is that? We're going to probably be using that a lot in this podcast.
Yeah. So A&R, it's about predicting, preventing, mitigating, and enabling recovery from climate hazards. And we use both terms because we believe both adaptation, or the A, and resilience, the R, are together very much needed to see the kind of resilient society and economy that we need. So we think of adaptation as adjusting to the impacts of climate change. And we think of resilience as a system's ability to continue working and functioning in the face of those impacts and changes.
Folks, this is a substantial playbook, and I highly recommend there'll be a link in the show notes for you guys to look at. Go dig into it. There's so much in there. And so we're not going to be able to get through all that, and that's not the purpose of this podcast, but just to give you a taste of those things. Katie, let's start off with governments. Governments are the largest spenders on A&R solutions. So what strategies can enhance their effectiveness in addressing climate risks?
Yeah, so this is one of the coolest findings in the report, and maybe one of the less surprising for us, that governments make up 51% of global demand when it comes to adaptation and resilience solutions. And just to give your listeners a high-level primer, this market is dominated by the United States, that actually invests the most out of all the countries that we looked at, but of course includes emerging and developing markets, which have huge demand for these solutions and are often suffering from the worst impacts of climate change. And what we found is that most governments are in need of resilient infrastructure as a number one priority. They're trying to make sure that their grid system and their transportation system and their roadways and all that stuff is resilient to climate. Secondarily, they're really in need of water resilience and water infrastructure that can address flooding, address excess water, address drought, etc. And then quite a few governments, like when you look at Brazil, for instance, are looking at how do we make sure agriculture is resilient? How do we make sure our ecosystems are resilient to climate change? And when we look at what governments are doing that is most effective here to try to move the needle and scale these solutions, there are a few things. Number one, we see that most governments around the world have started the adaptation planning process, which means they're looking at national policies for their governments that can tell them from a regulatory perspective what needs to be done to make society more resilient. So these policies are really important. They give governments a mandate to focus on adaptation and resilience. That's number one. Number two, many governments are funding innovation. They're funding programs that can help fund these solutions so that they're capable of buying them and using them for their own needs. For instance, we found that the United States last year actually invested over $1.6 billion into research and development programs that could help grow new solutions. And this is across agencies like NOAA and NSF, the Department of Ag, et cetera. Yeah. And finally, on a subnational note, there are a lot of cities and states around the world and in the United States leading on this. And where that's concerned, it's local infrastructure projects, many of which you've covered on the pod, really move the needle and help people experience resilience at the local level. And where that's concerned in the United States, for instance, we've got Boston, New York City, Seattle, San Francisco, all investing in huge coastal resilience projects. And that's really where the rubber meets the road and where some of these policies and these mandates and these innovative solutions end up translating into resilience impact.
I just want to put a plug for the Department of Defense. And I've done a couple episodes with CERTUP, which is one of their environmental investment innovation arms. And so they're actually directing a lot of money toward resilience and startups. So it is exciting how the different government agencies are working on it. We're going to pivot a little bit here. You describe corporations in this playbook as sleeping giants of A&R. How can businesses be incentivized to invest more proactively in resilience? And this is an important one. And we've talked about this, and we've only scratched the surface of it. And I guess that's what you're trying to encourage here, right?
Totally. Yes. I'm so glad you raised this point. So one thing that was very surprising to us in our research is that the data on which corporations were actually investing in adaptation and resilience was really hard to come by. But from what we did gather, and we believe this is undercounted, but from what we did gather, corporate demand only makes up 4% of annual demand today for adaptation and resilience solutions. And this is surprising in some ways because we find that over 50% of corporations that we surveyed have recognized their climate risks. They've been looking at how these impacts affect their businesses. Over 50% have acknowledged that they are experiencing these impacts. But when we look at what corporations are actually buying solutions or developing those internally, it's fewer. And so we see this as a really big area that must grow if we want the economy to be resilient. But for those that are taking action, I think this is a great lesson to other corporates that want to step up in the space. We see a lot of corporations that have fixed assets, like folks in the real estate space or electric utilities. We see folks that are in challenging geographies, or maybe there's more fire or there's more flooding. And we see those that have value chains at risk, perhaps because they're reliant on raw materials that could be hard to come by with some of these climate impacts ramping up. We see all those types of corporates increasing their activity in the near term because they understand that relative to maybe their peers in other industries, they hold the most risk. And those companies they're hardening their infrastructure, they're investing in their buildings and their assets. They're trying to come up with resilience plans and implement those for their facilities. So we are seeing some really good examples of action there. One example is I mentioned electric utilities are highly at risk, and that's very true. Exelon, the company, the electric utility, invested $7.2 billion in 2022 for grid advancements. And that's just 1 year of investment. So we could see how these companies are looking. They see the writing on the wall. Many of them have adaptation plans. And while around 50% of those plans don't actually call on them to take action on those plans for 5 to 10 years, we do see some early movers. And I think that those are good emblems for those that aspire in this space to take a look at.
Another area that I find very exciting is the idea of startups. Of course, that's different from corporations. These are new businesses that are trying to get into the space, get private money. And when I got started in Adaptation, the word startup wasn't even mentioned once. And so I think that's this exciting development. It's something that you're in what advice would you give entrepreneurs in the space to secure support and grow? Because again, there's not a lot of investment money there, but there's going to be this big demand.
Exactly. Once again, a big finding of the report, Doug, and not particularly surprising to us, is that, as you mentioned, the number of companies that are purely focused on adaptation in the climate tech space really pales in comparison to those that are working on decarbonization. We, of course, know this. It's 12% of that whole of climate tech that are focused on pure play adaptation, and they're only receiving 3% of the funds. As you said, they've got a number of headwinds up against them that they're dealing with. And so from an advice perspective, we tell entrepreneurs the following. It's number one, if you haven't started a company yet, look at where there is really strong market demand. So look at the spaces where corporations and consumers and governments are buying products and try to point yourself in that direction. And then for those that have companies, our advice is think about what kind of benefits your solution offers. We don't see a lot of startups out there saying, we sell resilience and adaptation, right? Like many startups sell less risk to businesses, or they sell food and water access, or they sell positive health outcomes. We really counsel people to think about what specific resilience benefits can you offer a customer and how do you articulate those? Another piece of advice that we give startups is to look at creative business models. I think we know from many of the episodes you've hosted that whether it's an insurtech company or it's a startup selling to a government, there are circuitous paths to market often for these sorts of companies where they need channel partners, they need distributors, maybe they need to be part of a government subcontract. They have to be creative about how they reach customers. So that's another piece of advice that we offer entrepreneurs. And hopefully we'll see that this really change in a few years. We'll do the math again, Doug, and we'll see far more than 12% of climate tech companies focused on this critical area.
Again, we're not going to be able to dig into all the things that are in the playbook, but I picked out things that I think are really interesting. And one of the things you identify as a blind spot are health and social systems. And I agree. I just haven't covered public health much at all in the podcast. Why do you think they lag behind other sectors?
Holy cow. Yeah, it's $1 million question. Maybe I'll take a second to break down one of the topics you raised, which is climate and health. And for your listeners that may be curious, The Lancet just released their countdown report for 2024 on climate and health. So really recommend taking a look at that. But just in general, in terms of demand, we all know, and I think the 5th National Climate Assessment shows this in myriad ways, that climate impacts are worsening, right? So we're seeing higher temperatures, we're seeing extreme weather. And what that means is that people are just way more exposed. So that means that they're exposed to extreme heat, they're exposed to poor air quality, maybe water scarcity, lack of food, etc. And this exposure leads to health outcomes, right? And the severity of those health outcomes really depends on a number of factors for people, like where they are geographically, where they sit from a socioeconomic standpoint, standpoint, maybe how exposed they've been in a day or like what pre-existing health conditions they have. But to give you a sense of the range of issues, we're seeing health outcomes, including everything from mild to severe heat-related illness to serious respiratory illnesses to, of course, increased vector-borne illness, which leads to disease and mortality, to, for instance, mental health issues. So there are tons of ways climate and health are overlapping. And this is really creating, as you were alluding to, serious demand for solutions, whether those are improved early warning systems or better wearables for heat or higher quality air quality filters. So we think this is a huge area, Doug, for entrepreneurs to look at. And I won't go into it at length, but I'll say to your point on social systems, when we looked at where in communities are additional solutions needed, we also found that early warning systems, not only for health, but for disasters are really needed. Like, how do people know that there's a wildland fire around the corner and when it's going to reach potentially their community? How do they know if a convective storm is headed their way? We're not quite where we could be in communicating those things to communities and helping them understand how to act. So that is another bucket, early warning systems and post-disaster recovery, that we're asking folks to think about from an innovation standpoint.
Academic research comes up in the playbook and it plays a role in innovation. I deal with a lot of academics on this podcast. They're doing a lot of exciting work, a lot of planning and such, but I don't necessarily see them connecting with people in the private sector or going to the same conferences. And I think that's just the nature of the different fields they're in. But there's so much happening at these universities. And occasionally they step into these other areas. But how can you create those partnerships? And does that come up in the playbook of getting those two groups to meet?
It's such a good question. Yeah, I would say so. To your first point, there are so many interesting research initiatives that I think not everyone realizes are adaptation and resilience linked that are happening around the US and around the world. For instance, we saw a ton of research on resilient crop production, a ton of research on leveraging geospatial data and satellites to promote climate resilience. We saw quite a bit out there on water treatment and availability. So there's a lot of research out there. And I think one of the big barriers, Doug, the first barrier I'll mention to researchers turning these brilliant research ideas into companies is the support gap. So this is the lack of climate resilient specific accelerators and incubators out there that can help folks that want to take something out of the lab and build it into a product to translate that innovation into a product. And where that's concerned, we found that whereas in the decarbonization space, there have been over 150 accelerators, many of whom have worked with researchers in the mitigation space, we find in the adaptation space, there are only 11 accelerators. These are tried and true methods of translating research into new products, and we need more of them. The second thing I'll say is that research money is fairly high, as I mentioned before, the $1.6 billion from the US government alone last year. But when we look at that next tranche of capital that entrepreneurs need to actually start a company after they've been in academia, we see a real capital gap where there's not enough pre-seed and seed stage funding for these entrepreneurs or these prospective entrepreneurs. So you could think of this as concessionary government grants or early stage risk capital for startups. And we really have to fill this capital gap if we want to incentivize more researchers to take this wonderful research and start companies.
You've probably encountered this in my own experiences with foundations or government grants. The problem is that there's so many strings attached and you almost have to demonstrate that you're going to be successful. And that's the difference between startups and these government grants. Is like the whole point of the startup is, all right, you're taking a chance. You've got an idea and you got to run with it and it might fail. And I think foundations and governments, they want to just guarantee that this isn't going to fail. And the grantee, they have to demonstrate it's not going to fail. What do you think of that? Because I have my own long experience in the nonprofit sector and it really just stifles, I think, innovation. But it's, I blew that $100,000 grant, but we were at least trying something different.
Yeah, I think that there can be sometimes a paradox where we know when we look at the capital stack, when you look at capital available to entrepreneurs, that they really are reliant on the public sector to provide that kind of risk-friendly capital at the early stages that allows entrepreneurs to spend money fairly freely and with few constraints in order to test out a new product or idea. But to your point, oftentimes programs from government ironically do not achieve those goals because they can be fairly stringent. And yes, we definitely need more programs that offer research grants with fewer strings attached to entrepreneurs. We mentioned in the report the Massachusetts Clean Energy Energy Center issues a few types of grants, including the Catalyst grant, that are really good and great examples of how governments can issue grants like this. We also need training programs for researchers. Not all researchers inherently understand business, and not all of them are ready to become CEOs or founders of companies. And where that's concerned, there's a really wonderful program called the Activate Fellowship, which funds researchers to learn how to do business, to explore commercializing their product. And once again, to your point, with fewer strings attached, really funds their work in the lab and their work building their business. And we need more programs like this too.
The playbook also identifies gaps in capital, demand, and ecosystem support. And we can't go too much into that, but just what would be consumer demand? What does that look like?
Yeah, consumer demand is really interesting. About 50% of U.S. households are at extreme risk from climate impacts, and the majority of Americans understand this. And when we look into it, we see that this consumer bucket is actually second to governments in volume. So it's 45% of the global demand that we found. In the developing world, that's largely smallholder farmers. But to focus on the US, in the United States, that's really homeowners and folks that are saying, I realize I need to harden my home for it to be resilient, or I realize that we need some sort of source of backup power. One thing that we found from a collaboration with Forest Marsh that provided some data to us that they did on a national survey is that homeowners are first and foremost concerned about insurance premiums. Then they're concerned about power outages and air pollution in their health, where climate change is concerned. And all of the spending trend lines we looked at, whether it was for backup generators or air conditioners or air purifiers, really backed up that demand. So we're seeing a lot of new consumer interest in adaptation solutions.
So, Katie, one of the things is, as I was going through this, and I have my own natural resource background, and I've obviously been exposed to a lot of different areas of adaptation, but do you guys have a solid glossary in there? Because in some ways you're creating new language here, and you're taking language from the business sector, and then there's the previous adaptation sector, and not everybody's necessarily familiar with it. So like the capital stack, if you're not really necessarily part of that area, you're not necessarily familiar with these terms. Is that part of the playbook?
Yes, Doug, we really created a set of words and templates and thoughts in the playbook that are designed to be understood by investors and entrepreneurs. So I do think that folks that are not in that space might read it and think to themselves, okay, what does this particular word mean? But we do use a lot of graphics and explanation to unpack some of our findings. So hopefully people will get the gist of it. I will say, though, related to your point, we absolutely have found that where private sector activity and resilience and adaptation are concerned, we have had to create a lot of new language and new frameworks for the business community in particular to understand opportunities in this area. And that's why we created Tailwind's Adaptation and Resilience Investor Taxonomy. And so you can see a little snapshot of it in the playbook, and also, of course, see the full version on our website. But this is a set of 8 different thematic areas, from industry and commerce to health to infrastructure to ag and food and agriculture, that we broke out to help create our own Tailwind-based worldview with partners of what are all the places that have to be adapted by the private sector. And within those 8 themes, we identified 35 sectors that require adaptation solutions. We're on a learning journey with everybody in your listenership to better understand this space, but that's what we've done to try to explain ourselves a little bit more. And that taxonomy is used throughout the playbook.
I don't think it's in there, but if it is, great. But if it's not, if you do sort of a revision or anything, just make it crystal clear that adaptation is not sustainability, because if you have a lot of corporate folks looking at this, they really need to understand that. And this playbook could hopefully educate them on that.
Definitely. Yes, we did include that in some of our high level definitions, but I think it's a reminder that cannot be reminded enough. And for anyone that's interested in the taxonomy, people can check that out too on our website.
Katie, we are at the most important part of the playbook, and that's the recommendations. People are like, all right, what am I going to do with this? And so at the 30,000 foot level, and I encourage people, again, look at the playbook. We're not going to cover them all here. I'm just going to ask a few of these here. But first off, I find measuring impact really interesting. Tell us a bit about some of the recommendations there.
Yeah, we have some strong recommendations around developing metrics and standards in our recommendations for policymakers within this report, Doug, as you're mentioning. But in truth be told, measuring impact and understanding metrics within this space is a huge challenge for the private sector as well. And what we're talking about here is thinking beyond a net zero equivalent. So we know in mitigation and decarbonization, there's a standard way of measuring progress. It's focused around greenhouse gas emission reduction. And of course, we know in adaptation and resilience, there is no one metric. And so what we think is needed, although in the report we do list out a number of example organizations like UNEP and the World Bank and GIN that have developed metrics frameworks, but what we think is needed is more conversation between the public and private sector to talk about what good measurement looks like in this space. And we think that more research and work is needed in this area, more funding is needed from the public sector and from philanthropy. And that's actually something at Tailwind that we plan to do more work on.
Another area that I'm interested in is community engagement. Give us some of those recommendations.
Yes, through our findings and through conversations with all our partners, we know with total confidence that if adaptation solution is deployed in a community, two things. One, it's only going to be effective. It's only going to drive resilience and adaptation if the community actually needs that solution. And there's no way to know that unless there is community engagement by those building solutions with those who will be using it. So we really advocate for community engagement in the playbook, and we point to a number of frameworks that can help entrepreneurs think about best practices where that's concerned. The second reason why this is so important is the concept of maladaptation, which we also point to in the playbook. And this is the idea that if you don't do good planning for your adaptation solution, something might end up out there in the field that's maybe driving more greenhouse gas emissions by mistake, or maybe it's increasing social vulnerability. And this sort of consideration is really critical for entrepreneurs as well, and really something that cannot be considered without, once again, speaking to those that will be using the solution and understanding their lived experience.
And the final one I want you to dig into is for policymakers. Obviously, they're going to be driving a lot of these decisions.
Yeah. So policymakers, as you probably saw from the playbook, we had 2 slides for policymakers.
Yes.
Plenty of things. Yeah. Plenty of things that we need them to dig into. And the 3 main areas, Doug, are really one, regulation. As I said, adaptation planning is happening at the global level across national governments. The United States is the only developed country without one of these plans. We really need there to be robust regulation at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, if we want to be able to enshrine adaptation and resilience goals into our work around the world. So this is really important. We need best practices to be shared. We need these policies to be passed everywhere. Second of all, standards and definitions. We talked a little bit about standardizing metrics approaches. Definitions are also really important. The Department of Energy doesn't have a publicly available definition for adaptation technology. Stuff like that's got to change. We need to have adaptation definitions related to adaptation solutions present where there are climate innovation programs. That's just one element from that piece. And then we really need funding. I talked about the capital gap that we have found, capital gaps we have identified at Tailwind with the very early stages when people are translating research out of the lab into companies. And then as they scale their companies and require more venture funding, the government has a really important role to play in funding accelerators and incubators or entrepreneurial fellowships, or some of, to your point, Doug, the flexible grant programs we were talking about, or the pilot programs needed to really take what is in the United States, our national treasure, where high quality research is concerned, and turn that into market opportunity. And that's something that we are calling on the public sector to do more of.
I encourage my listeners to dig into those recommendations. There's a lot more. There's other sections, and it's a very thorough area and a lot of great stuff in there. And so I want to pivot as we wrap this up, Katie, and dear and near to my heart is communication and marketing and trying to get the word out. And I look at all these different areas like, okay, the corporate sector isn't investing enough. Even the government sector isn't necessarily investing enough. A lot of this is plain like they don't understand what adaptation resilience is. It's a lack of awareness. How does that come up into your playbook? Because I think a lot of these things would be moving a lot faster if they just simply had basic awareness of the space. Some of them still think they're doing sustainability and ESG, and that is a big problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we say this all the time that decarbonization and adaptation, it's a yes, and we need both. But to your point, Doug, it's whereas in the decarbonization and mitigation space, there's been well over 20 years of communication and marketing and consensus building and learning about these topics. Whereas that's been the case on that side with adaptation and resilience, we're really just starting to scratch the surface and make sure that all sorts of practitioners in the public and private sector and in communities understand what this is. And of course, we feel confident that effort will be successful because unfortunately, all of us in our lived experience day to day are now becoming experts on this topic, right? We're the ones that need adaptation and resilience, and we're seeing those needs on a regular basis. But I think your point is well taken, and perhaps an area of additional research for Tailwind or a place where your listeners can lean in is, investing in resources like America Adapts and other platforms that are helping the people that can benefit from these solutions and these investments really understand how urgent they are.
Yeah, I like that. That's a nice plug. And I would like to bring up too, it's a common theme for everyone that President Biden, they released their National Resilience Framework last year, and there was nothing really about doing national communication strategy or anything along those lines. And then I did an episode where senator drafted a national adaptation plan, which we desperately need in the United States. And they had some details like you may be a chief adaptation officer. Again, there was no sort of language about, okay, let's have a national communication strategy. And I have been saying it's the first thing we should be doing because we're going to be struggling doing adaptation right for decades. But at least in the meantime, we could be educating the public and just it's become so wonky. It's these really tight orbits. And a lot of the folks that are in this orbit just don't think, oh, let's maybe create a bit more awareness out there. And there's a missed opportunity. And this is not in you. I'm obviously giving examples of other areas like giving short change to awareness building. And obviously.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. On that, I completely agree with you. And on that note, it's been exciting to us and a real bright spot to see 50% of states hire chief resilience officers and to see some of the policy decisions coming out of states like the $10 billion bond bill that California passed that's focused on resilience last month. So I think that where this is concerned, it seems like local governments and communities, and obviously, as I mentioned, consumers really get it. And I think that's hopefully going to drive larger national awareness.
I like your thinking. So what now? You have this playbook. You are out there. You did a webinar. You're getting the word out. You're on this podcast. So what are you hoping to do? Are you going to spend some time here getting it out there?
Definitely, yes. So we are obviously on the media circuit, talking about the playbook, talking about our findings. We'll be continuing to share it with our broader network. We, of course, as you mentioned to your listeners earlier, hope everybody cracks it open, takes a look at it. Even if you don't have time to look through the whole thing, we've got a nice executive summary on our website. We also have a recording of us talking about the findings, which I know you saw, Doug. So we encourage people to crack it open and get in there. And just in closing, as I said previously, this is a huge challenge, of course, for humanity. But if there's any takeaway that we want listeners to be thinking about it, that this is also a massive untapped market opportunity, that there are dollars available for adaptation solutions. So whether you're a homeowner or an investor or a corporation, a policymaker, an entrepreneur, there's something for everyone in here, and everyone should be participating in this growing sector.
Here's some feedback, even though you didn't ask for it. You have a summary of this, but I highly recommend when I was going through it, I felt like there were so many sections that really stood alone. And so breaking it up into bite-sized pieces that, okay, here are the recommendation sections, here's the corporate demand section. I really do think they stand alone. And having those pieces separated, I think people are going to approach it differently. Who knows? Maybe there's a partner out there who could help you do such a thing. But I just think you're going to find it's going to spread differently. And I think in really good ways if you had those bite-sized pieces.
I like that. I think that's great advice. Thank you, Doug.
Last question. If you could recommend one person to come on this podcast, who would it be? And maybe some of the playbook will inspire you.
That's a great question. There are so many incredible people that are working in this space. I would say probably Shalini from Pre-Collective. Have you spoken with her yet?
About 3 times, so.
All right. Another person is Mish Tadani, who runs Rhizome. Have you talked to him?
No. So there's someone.
There are a number of companies in Tailwind's orbit that are doing incredible work at the intersection of policy and business from a climate resilience standpoint. And his company is really focused on making sure that electric utilities, that our power grid, that communities are resilient to climate change and able to not have power interruptions or anything like that. And what they're doing is really groundbreaking. So he's my pick.
All right. Excellent recommendation. Katie, it's always a pleasure to have you on. And I think what you and Emily are doing with Tailwind is so exciting. I just think I have watched the adaptation space evolve over decades now. And just what you guys are doing really excites me. And the playbook, congratulations. I'm sure it was a monumental effort. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks for all your mission critical work in this space.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Katie for joining the podcast. Definitely check out their playbook. A link is in the show notes. They've really done the entire adaptation sector a huge service through this playbook. Even if you're in the public sector or nonprofit sector, this playbook is going to benefit you. We all need to start thinking about adaptation in different ways. And the startup sector could benefit some of the adaptation planning we're doing today. We're all going to have to get creative in the years ahead, especially in light of the new administration where emphasis on climate change will disappear and things like climate adaptation will have to shift. So definitely take a look at their playbook, and I'm sure they'd love to hear from you if you have ideas on collaboration and partnerships. Katie reminded us that adaptation is more than just about surviving. It's about thriving in the face of climate risks. The playbook isn't just a report. It's a call to action for all of us, policymakers, investors, community leaders, and everyday citizens. As Katie said, success hinges on collaboration, creativity, and a commitment to tackling these challenges ahead. Let's do it. Okay, this episode's hot take. And for those who aren't familiar and haven't heard me do one in previous episodes, a hot take is a controversial opinion that has no factually right or wrong answer. It's a knee-jerk response to an issue. Here's my hot take. Katie and I were talking about people in the business sector not knowing the difference between sustainability and adaptation. So my hot take is that this is only going to get worse. There are going to be people in the private sector who aren't going to bother learning the differences between climate adaptation and sustainability, and that's going to drive a lot of adaptation planning in the years ahead. And that's going to be a problem because they're not going to understand the implications of adapting to climate change versus looking at some long-term sustainable model for society. You can't do something like managed retreat in a sustainable way. There are going to be many tough decisions that we're going to have to make as we adapt to climate change, period. And the business sector is not going to want to understand those nuances, and it's going to be to the detriment to us all in the adaptation universe. All right, I don't necessarily think that this will happen, but that's just my hot take on the possibility. What do you guys think? And finally, imagine showcasing your organization's achievements to a vast network of climate and adaptation professionals through America Adapts, a widely acclaimed podcast. Sponsoring an episode gives your company the perfect platform to tell your adaptation story and share your message with an influential audience. Go beyond the limits of webinars and white papers. Let's create a compelling podcast episode that highlights your organization's remarkable work. Together, we'll identify the experts who best represent your achievements and craft a story that resonates with members, funders, and board members while leaving a lasting impact. Podcasts offer enduring value, continue to educate, inspire long after the release. I partner with prestigious organizations like Battelle, NRDC, World Wildlife Fund, Harvard, UCLA, many more, and I'd love to add your organization to the list. Ready to make an impact? Email me at americaadapts@gmail.com to learn more about how podcast storytelling can elevate your message and amplify your mission. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.